Hello, and welcome to America in Crisis, The Dark Road Ahead. Please welcome editor of The New Republic, Michael Tomasky.
Good evening, folks, and thank you so much for joining us for this conversation that I think is going to be lively and interesting and I think very important at this juncture in our nation's history. I first want to say that we're all really sorry that we couldn't live for those of you who did procure tickets for the live event. Good evening, folks, and we're really sorry. We had to make a judgment call yesterday. We made it, and we're nevertheless grateful that you joined us via Zoom, and to everyone who has joined us. We have a very large audience, and we're very grateful to all of you. We fear that we'll have opportunities, alas, to do America in Crisis events in the future, probably in the spring, and it won't snow. But we want to thank you for joining us under these circumstances. I don't want to talk too long. I want to get right to it. I'll just say a couple of things. The New Republic wants to thank our co-sponsors for this event, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and the Rachel Carson Council. They both do such important work, and we're very grateful to them for joining us in tonight's venture. We had to come up with a name for this panel in early December or so, and I think I just came up with America in Crisis because I figured it would be true to one degree or another. Well, I didn't know exactly how true it would be. We already have people saying that we're already in a constitutional crisis in the third week of this presidency. And we're seeing something that I don't think any of us quite expected. We expected extremism. We expected quick action. We expected a lot of things. We did not expect knowing and willful and contemptuous violation of the law with an attitude that was kind of like, we'll do what we want and see if you can stop us. That's what we are here to try to do tonight. And we're very grateful to all of you for pitching into this effort. So I think we have a terrific night ahead of us, and let's get started. Our first speaker, our welcoming keynote speaker, we're very grateful to have the congressman from the 2nd District of Mississippi. He was chairman of the Homeland Security Committee for a while, and then, of course, most notably, he was chairman of the January 6th Select Committee, and we thought he would have many interesting thoughts to share with us about the situation we're in. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and I'll turn it over to Representative Bennie Thompson of Mississippi.
Please welcome our opening keynote, the U.S. Representative of Mississippi, Bennie Thompson.
Well, thank you so much. And Michael, I appreciate you and New Republic allowing me to come and give a few comments on your topic, America in Crisis. That, believe me, is an understatement. I thought January 6th was the real crisis for this country. And indeed it was, but little did I know that 4 years later, that crisis would expand with the election of Donald Trump as president. I believe that if a person runs for an office and say he wants to inflict retribution, he wants to be a dictator for a day, and actually tell some people that if you vote for me this time, you'll never have to worry about voting again. So little did I know how true, since January 20th of this year, those comments have come true. So my friends, we find ourselves in a moment of chaos, confusion, and uncertainty. This is not by accident. Those comments I referenced earlier were made by John Trump, who's now president of the United States. This administration has built itself on deception and is fueled by dividing people. The executive orders that we've all come to expect in the wee hours of the morning have come as no surprise now. We don't know what comes next. We just know that in the orderly transfer of government, this is not how we do business. But nonetheless, we find ourselves at this moment. It has been made clear that its mission is not to serve people, but to dismantle the very institutions that uphold our democracy. From the moment this president took office, he began signing those executive orders at an unprecedented rate. He wants to undo progress, punish the political opponents, and consolidate power in ways that threaten the very fabric of our nation. These orders, whether they are birthright citizenship, changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico, federal hiring freezes, or whatever, have stripped a lot of protections from our most vulnerable communities, gutted environmental safeguards, undermined public education, and even placed, in some instances, our nation at security risk. These reckless orders have created a real crisis for this country. Families all over America are struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living, while federal resources are being redirected away from the programs that help them the most. I had a call earlier in the week that somebody wanted to know what's the difference between a pause and a freeze in resources. I told them there's no difference. If the resources are not forthcoming, it doesn't matter what you call them, they're just not available. Seniors, veterans who rely on government assistance are being thrown into uncertainty, and small businesses already struggling are left wondering what comes next. A good example of what we're talking about is a lot of the programs that are at risk. Those resources, whether they are SNAP or whatever, are being spent in communities. And so if those resources are not available, then those small businesses are hurt. And let's be clear, this chaos is by design. While Americans are left scrambling to understand what's happening, the president and his allies are focusing on one thing: consolidating power. We saw that when he appointed Elon Musk to head the DOGE committee. Elon, as you know, comes from South Africa. He's been brought in by the Trump administration to seize the control of government funding, an unprecedented move that undermines the very sovereignty of our democracy. What I mean by that is historically the budget of this government has been a responsibility of Congress. Now, all of a sudden, that responsibility has been shifted to an unelected body subject to executive orders, which ultimately is accountable only to one man. So we've seen these unlawful acts playing out. People are executive order tired. And what will they do next? They call press conferences, standing before the American people, trying to justify the unjustifiable. What is it that our nation's financial stability is in the hands of someone who has no allegiance to our Constitution or our values? Not only that, but Elon and Trump have no right to do what they are doing. And so Democrats and others have been fighting tooth and nail to stop these unlawful actions. Lawsuits, 55 so far, have been filed by unions, nonprofits, and others. This is important because Republicans control both houses as well as the presidency. And so they are, for lack of a better term, frozen in time. My colleagues will tell me and others in private conversations, well, we might disagree with what's being done, but we can't publicly come out against it. If we do, we'll be primaried. So we have what our founding fathers put together was what we thought was a good way of running government. Separate and distinct judiciary, executive, and legislative, each with co-equal functions to do certain things. And now all that has been, for lack of a better definition, consolidated in the executive branch. And so, as I said, we have about 55 lawsuits out here. I understand just before we went on, the federal judge said that the administration can go forward with its goal of offering buyouts to employees. I'm certain that that action will be appealed. However, employees call on a regular basis, very concerned about this email they received from somebody they don't know to respond to an address they've never heard before. And all of a sudden, their life has flashed before them, and there's actually no real place they can go for results. They go to a supervisor, and in many instances, the supervisors receive the same email. So we have to push back. And I say to those of you who are on this call, we have to push back. But we can't give up. And here's what gives me hope. The power does not rest solely in the hands of one man. It has always and always will rest with the people. So my message to you today is simple. This is not the time to sit on the sidelines. This is not the time to let frustration turn into silence. This is the time to engage, to make sure your voice is heard in every corner of the country. That means showing up at the ballot box, in the courts, in the streets, in the halls of Congress. It means organizing, mobilizing, and make sure that no action taken by this administration goes unchallenged. It means pushing back against misinformation, demanding accountability, and ensuring that our democracy works for the people, not against them. We've been here before. We've seen dark times. We've faced uncertain futures, but we've always found a way to go forward. And I believe with everything in me that we will do it again. So let's stay in the fight. Let's make our voices heard. Let's take back our democracy together, because the only way we lose is by stop fighting. And I don't know about you, but I refuse to lose. When we fight, we win. Thank you so much.
Please welcome your first panel for The Dangers of Christian Nationalism and Project 2025 with moderator, author, and journalist Sarah Posner.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to have a panel with three great speakers tonight on the dangers of Christian nationalism. First, we have Rachel Laser. She is the president and CEO of Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, an organization that I'm sure you're all familiar with. She knows that the work of Americans United has never been more important than it is right now. She's been a leader in the fight to defeat the serious threat of Christian nationalism and to defend religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Alessandro Terenzoni is the vice president of public policy at Americans United, and he leads the organization's policy team in its critical work to promote positive policy that defends and supports church-state separation at both the federal and the state levels. And finally, we have Amanda Tyler, who is Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, leading the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. She is also the author of the book, How to End Christian Nationalism. So we're looking forward to hearing from her tonight. So Christian nationalism is an extreme ideology which holds that God ordained America as a Christian nation and that it is the duty of Christians to restore its Christian founding and run the government from this worldview. This idea is front and center in Project 2025 and in the numerous actions that the Trump administration is taking right now. We're going to look at this from three broad angles, the way that they're trying to impose Christian nationalism on the rest of the country. And then we're going to talk about what the Baptist Joint Committee and Americans United are doing to push back, and what individuals like all of you in the audience can do also. So I wanted to start with Amanda and get you to talk about how, right out of the box, both Trump and others in his administration, including Vice President Vance, have been denigrating Christians who don't agree with this Christian nationalist ideology, and are engaging in attempts to enforce compliance with the MAGA claim that they represent the true Christianity. Some examples include, it seems like a long time ago, but it was only a few weeks ago, Trump's verbal assault on Bishop Buddy, Vance's disparagement of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which drew a rebuke from the Pope, and another perhaps more alarming or real world kind of situation is Trump's creation of the task force to combat what they claim is anti-Christian bias. Can you talk about what you're seeing in these first weeks of the administration in their efforts to really define and enforce one particular religious view?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Sarah. For several years now, I have said that I think the single biggest threat to religious freedom for all people in America today is the rise of Christian nationalism. And I think we're seeing that real time right now. Christian nationalism suggests that to be a real American, to be a true American, that one has to be a Christian. That obviously sidelines people from other religious faiths and people who don't claim a faith tradition. But what we're seeing is it also sidelines a number of Christians as well. Because of Christian nationalism and its overlap with white supremacy, we've seen the violence at, for instance, Black churches for decades and centuries, including with the burning of Black Lives Matter signs in the lead up to January 6th. So the hardening of the violent offenders on January 6th really, kind of justifies or kind of will spur this kind of violence on. But we're also seeing this administration take on immigrant churches and churches that serve immigrant populations as part of the rescission of the policy that protected sensitive locations like hospitals and schools, but also houses of worship from ICE raids that might interrupt the services. And we've seen a number of religious denominations and organizations responding in the last few weeks by filing suits to challenge these actions, the rescission of the memo under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. I think that these groups are really challenging the courts to live up to what they have built over the last several years when they've talked about the protection of free exercise of religion in this country. And it's being put to the test now in the face of government hostility to religion. And as you point out, we have seen that hostility directed at religious leaders, including Christian religious leaders, over the last several weeks.
I would say especially Christian leaders.
Exactly. And, the separation of religion and government has given religious leaders through the centuries the necessary independence to speak truth to power. And we saw Bishop Miriam Buddy do exactly that in her sermon on January 21st at the Washington National Cathedral. We saw that the retribution was swift, with President Trump questioning her religious status, referring to her as, quote, the so-called bishop, and then MAGA world piling swiftly on with attacks on her character and her fitness. One member of Congress even suggested that she should be deported for her sermon. Several other members of Congress are co-sponsoring House Resolution 59 that expresses the sense of the House of Representatives that her sermon was, quote, a display of political activism and condemning its distorted message. This is very alarming to see the U.S. Congress actually weighing in on what is a proper religious message. It violates the idea of separation of church and state, and also, of course, is a violation of religious freedom. But those actions were quickly followed, as you point out, by other examples of officials and allies denigrating and attempting to discredit Christian religious leaders that are at odds with the policies of the president. Because the U.S. Catholic bishops came out strongly against the anti-immigrant policies of this administration, Vice President Vance actually called on their motives, suggesting that they had financial motives and not religious motives for opposing the president. And then we saw a week later, first discredited General Michael Flynn suggest that the Lutheran social service organizations that received funding as part of public-private partnerships to provide aid to populations around the world, suggesting that they were money laundering, again, putting Lutheran in quotes in his tweet, suggesting that they weren't really religious. And then Elon Musk very quickly re-upping that tweet and saying that they would take care of these quote unquote illegal payments, of course, without any kind of basis to make these claims at all. So I think what they're doing is really sending the signal that if Christians are not in line with the policies of this administration, that they will be sidelined, they will be discredited, and they will be open to attack. These are obvious examples of violations of religious freedom. And then to add insult to injury, we had the announcement of this new task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias that was announced last week. First, we have to say there is no widespread anti-Christian bias in this majority Christian country.
In fact, they're the ones who are spreading a certain kind of anti-Christian bias through all these attacks, both verbally and on social media.
Exactly. Very well put. It also denigrates and distracts from the very real Christian persecution that's happening in countries around the world today, as well as the bias, the anti-Semitism and the anti-Muslim bias in this country that occurs at much higher rates. And so I think that the concern that I have about this, in addition to all of those reasons, as well as just the hypocrisy of trying to close offices, DEI offices that actually would try to root out bias and then opening up this new office, is that this task force will be used to enforce a kind of theological conformity that will harm everyone's religious freedom, including the religious freedom of Christians whose religious views are at odds with the president. And so just to close, I am reminded, Representative Thompson reminded us of the framers and their intentions when they set up the Constitution. One of their intentions, of course, was to disestablish religion from government control in order to help our pluralistic democracy, but also to help religion. And so I want to remind us of the words of Virginia Baptist pastor John Leland, who was a contemporary and a neighbor of James Madison. He wrote in the late 18th century, "The fondness of magistrates to foster Christianity has done it more harm than all the persecutions ever did. Persecution, like a lion, tears the saints to death, but leaves Christianity pure. State establishment of religion, like a bear, hugs the saints, but corrupts Christianity and reduces it to a level with state policy." I think we're seeing John Leland's words in real time right now, and it should cause concern to all Americans who care about religious freedom.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. Okay, we're going to come back to some of or a lot of what you said. I want to talk to Rachel now about direct assaults on bodily autonomy and rights in order to enforce concept of God's design or natural law relating to, gender affirming care or access to abortion and contraception. What are you seeing in terms of specifically what they're doing, inside agencies right now? I mean, I know we've all heard about the executive order purporting to ban gender affirming care and banning trans service members from the military. But talk about things that maybe haven't been in the news as much that people might not even be aware of.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's nice to see you. And Amanda, it's an honor to be on the panel with you. And as I've told you, as the first Jewish leader of Americans United, my 7-year anniversary is tomorrow. But I know I told you from the start how comforting it is to see Christians working against Christian nationalism. I really appreciate your organization's good work. I wanted to start, Sarah, by talking about just something very basic, because there's so much disinformation out there that I actually want to talk about why we're talking about bodily autonomy issues in the context of Christian nationalism. So Christian nationalism's end goal is to destroy church-state separation so that they can embed their ultra-conservative Christian viewpoint into the law, right? And so what we're used to thinking about church-state separation being about is everyone's right not to have the government favor one set of religious beliefs over others or religion over non-religion, right? So we'll start there. That's not even a given anymore. There's so much disinformation about church-state separation. I feel like we got to go back to the basics for ourselves again and again. But the thing is, church-state separation doesn't just protect your right to believe as you choose. It also protects your freedom to live as your authentic self and have control over your body. And there's sort of a connecting of the dots that we need to do today to illustrate how important church-state separation is to our daily lives that I think we've all taken for granted. So we should all be able to make our own decisions about our own bodies according to our own belief systems, right? And so that's what church-state separation protects, not just your right to believe as you choose, but your right to live as yourself. What we're seeing today as church-state separation is being undermined to advance this Christian nationalist agenda is the taking away of that freedom to make your own decision about your own body. And right, not according to someone else's narrow religious litmus test. And I'll just give sort of 3 illustrations of areas where this is showing up. And you referenced one of them, which is in the context of LGBTQ equality. Project 2025, the 920-page playbook of ultra conservative administration that has borne out to be their actual playbook, talks about preference for biblically based families, right? And I think that's really important to know that what's changed about today is folks who are Christian nationalists are brazen and emboldened, and they're saying all the quiet parts out loud. And so another example would be this executive order, which is taking an official government position that there are just 2 sexes, male and female. What are intersex people supposed to do, by the way, according to that definition? But something that also betrays that is a religious definition of gender is something else that was sneaked into that executive order, which is a parenthetical about how your sex is established from conception.
Right.
Right. And so that is also right. And so we're sort of seeing things like that show up when Speaker Mike Johnson.
It's the new life begins at conception.
Life begins at conception, and when Speaker Mike Johnson last month was talking about this House bill banning transgender athletes from participating in sports, he cited the book of Genesis from the Bible to justify the bill.
To attempt to justify the bill.
In an attempt to justify the bill. And, I beg your pardon, Speaker Johnson, but what does your personal faith have to do with American law? You know, America, just to remind you, is proudly the originator of the promise of church-state separation and religious freedom, right? That was ours to boast about, right? We were the first, you know, the original, the OGs, and, you know, it's just sort of a disgrace. So that's just LGBTQ. Just really quickly on abortion, an example of the way this is showing up was in Missouri. We filed a lawsuit after the Missouri law embedded into the law the language that the Lord Almighty is the author of life, right into the law. And as the lawmakers were justifying their abortion ban in Missouri, they said all the quiet parts out loud. As a Catholic, I do believe that life begins at conception. And again, you know, great, but you're legislating for the people. So we sued under the church-state separation protections of the state. But this is also showing up. The third example would be in the IVF context, right? And that went a little too far. There was like a lot of backing away. But if you recall, last February, Alabama's Supreme Court issued a decision in an IVF case asserting frozen embryos have the same rights as children.
So do you think that, do you see any signs that the administration is picking up on some of these cues with regard to things that have happened in these very conservative states? To, you know, that there's sort of a communication back and forth between Project 2025 and maybe what's happening in some of these far right states, and that there's some overlap or you know, use of some of the same strategies?
Absolutely. I mean, for one, there is a $1 billion shadow network behind this all, right? Which is literally woven leaders in the administration, right? Authors of Project 2025, like Russ Vogt, you know, are leaders in the administration.
Who's now the OMB director, right?
Right. Yeah. And, you know, and what we're seeing in these, even in these early executive orders, you know, on gender, on radical indoctrination in schools, right, like throughout is the enacting of this Project 2025 agenda. So absolutely. And, you know, everything that Amanda talked about on top of it. And I'll just conclude by saying the good news is there really is an antidote to this Christian nationalism. And
we're going to get to that part.
And I was going to say, and we're going to get to that part.
I want to talk to Alessandro, though, because his expertise is in education. And another thing that we're seeing right now are frontal attacks on freedom of thought, academic freedom, civil rights, these anti-DEI crackdowns, threats to universities and school systems, and attempts to destroy public education in favor of vouchers, probably for religious schools. So what are you seeing in these first few weeks that's, you know, really jumping out at you as like sort of top tier concerns in this area? And please take into account what's happening at the Department of Education right now.
I certainly do. So thank you for that question, and I'm really glad to be here. So we're discussing this in terms of threats of Christian nationalism, but I'd like to turn that idea on its head, because education is the biggest threat to Christian nationalism that we have, right? And isn't that exactly why Christian nationalists are gunning for public education for our colleges and universities? Because an informed public has always been a threat to authoritarianism since time immemorial. And now is no different. So here's what we're seeing initially. We see these executive orders. Amanda brought up the one eradicating anti-Christian bias. There are also executive orders ending, interesting that he used eradicating for Christian bias, but ending illegal discrimination and ending teaching radical indoctrination. But don't misunderstand, these are threats, right? Each of these is straight out of the Project 2025 playbook, obviously trying to do what? Curb public discourse, create situations where universities and college campuses and school districts are fearful, right? Are fearful of investigations by the federal government, fearful for their funding, threats to local and state control of schools, actually. In these orders, right, you have things like patriotic education, which is a very interesting euphemism. But the federal government is actually bound by law to stay out of curriculum decisions. This isn't often misunderstood, but that's what's sort of being implied and threatened in these executive orders. And then certainly threats to civil rights enforcement, right? This is squarely in that diversion of resources toolkit that they have, which is take from one to bolster another. And my question is, what are, someone who's a religious minority, who's a person of color, a woman or a girl, an LGBTQ plus person gonna do when all federal resources relating to combating discrimination are pointed at anti-Christian bias and DEI initiatives? We've also seen this EO about, and the euphemisms around this topic are so many. This time, I think they called it educational freedom and opportunity, but it's a school voucher program. We've heard of school voucher programs before. They're all schemes to take money, taxpayer money, from public education and siphon them into private and often religious schools, right? We've seen this.
These are actually unpopular, even among voters in red states, as we saw in Kentucky last year, right?
That is absolutely correct. So vouchers were in ballot initiatives in one way or another in Colorado, Kentucky, and Nebraska, and they all failed soundly. These weren't close, right? And yet it's still being pushed. And what's really interesting is that anti-voucher sort of coalitions are very interesting. You've got religious freedom folks, you've got rural schools and rural communities who are really against this. You've got even homeschoolers are often jumping on board because these schemes really create systems that just take away possibility for most kids. It's really about diverting these taxpayer funds elsewhere. And part of that executive order was this idea of establishing a national voucher program. And folks, this is coming. And how just obvious that under this administration, it's looking like it's going to be a tax credit, a $100 billion program that's going to divert so much money, so many taxpayer funds away from other things, such as our public schools, and right into these private opportunities. And the last thing I want to talk about very quickly in terms of these threats is something that we all know was in Project 2025 and has been on the president's lips the entire time he was campaigning, which is what? Abolishing the Department of Education, right? So full disclosure, I used to work at the Department of Education. I was an attorney in the Office for Civil Rights there. And the Department of Education, setting aside for a moment that it was created 45 years ago by congressional action and cannot be undone by the stroke of a magic marker by the president, it's a civil rights agency, right? In everything that it does. It has an Office for Civil Rights that Project 2025 intends to move over to the Department of Justice. But what's also not discussed is that move also abandons all of the administrative enforcement of that office. The day-to-day work of my former colleagues that really does save kids' lives. I'm just going to say it that bluntly. Things like Title I funding, that's almost $20 billion that currently goes directly to the kids. What Project 2025 would suggest is either undoing it or making it a block grant that goes to states, and then they can divvy it up however they'd like, not necessarily to the schools and the kids that need it most. And then there's federal student aid, right? Which is a massive undertaking. We're talking trillions of dollars. And they want to shift that too. But there are actually laws that say these entities, these components need to be in the Department of Education. Right. So the point here is that Christian nationalism fears education. Yeah. It fears us educating ourselves, educating our kids. And that's the reason we have to defend it.
Okay. So now we're at the lightning round phase. We have only a few minutes left. I'm going to say each of you will have around 60 seconds to tell people in our audience tonight what they can do to get involved if the issue that you talked about tonight, is their specific thing that they want to get involved in. So first, Amanda.
Well, I would invite people to visit us at christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. You do not have to be a Christian in order to be involved in our work. But as Rachel was talking about earlier, this idea of trying to legislate a given religious view, it's not even the religious view that's held by most Christians, right? And so I think we are seeing a majority of Americans from all different religious faiths around the country really wanting to push back against this. We have been overwhelmed by interest in people wanting to set up local groups of Christians against Christian nationalism. We are also pushing out action alerts about how, again, they can tell their elected representatives to say no to these schemes, because many of these executive orders, this administration is limited in what they can do. And so it really will take acts of Congress in order to fully implement this. And so the time is now for people to get more engaged. And I think that's the theme of tonight, that all of us need to be more directly involved in the project of democracy. And there are so many organizations doing that today. And I'd invite everyone to join us at ChristiansAgainstChristianNationalism.org.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. Rachel.
Okay. I think we need to educate people about the importance of church-state separation, because it is the cure to Christian nationalism. And I think we can do that and make church-state separation come alive by telling stories and connecting the dots. If you care about LGBTQ equality, if you care about abortion rights, if you care about accurate science, and if you care about books being on our shelves of our public libraries and the right to read and learn, you care about church-state separation. 2, unite. This is such a divided time in our country. One of the reasons is because church-state separation is being undermined. But this is a great issue to unite around, right? We all have a stake in protecting religious freedom. So don't just do the pulpit exchange on Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Get together and unite around this issue, right? Muslims, Jews, Christians, Hindus, everybody, the non-religious, right? And then 3, recommit to church-state separation, and please join us at au.org. At au.org, Americans United, we also have a wonderful Summit for Religious Freedom in April that you can come to and feel the magic of being in a space with all of us coming together. It's just an amazing experience. www.thesurf.org.
Okay. Alessandro.
Yeah, I will try to keep it quick. So they have great messaging. And part of that great messaging is a lot of lying. Let's just be honest. And so my suggestions sort of echo what was already said of educating yourself and then educate others, right? Don't use phrases like school choice or believe them. Don't say DEI, say diversity, equity, and inclusion, and make people have to say to your face that those are the things they think are bad for America. And lastly, this might be a little bit obvious, but call your representatives. Now more than ever, it is important for these people to hear from their constituents, to hear about your fears, hear about your concerns, hear about these threats and how they are affecting your families, yourself, your well-being. They're hearing from Christian nationalists, believe me. So they need to hear from the rest of us too.
Okay.
And support AU and go to au.org for sure.
All right. I want to thank all 3 of you so much. You were all fantastic. And I hope that the audience, and I'm sure that the audience did, get a lot out of this very brief but informative panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Our next panel is Retribution, Trump 2.0 style, with moderator, staff writer of The New Republic, Greg Sargent.
Hi, everybody. I'm Greg Sargent, staff writer at The New Republic. I want to be clear at the outset that we mean retribution with a bit of an asterisk. Donald Trump and his allies, who have widely threatened to prosecute their enemies without cause, claim to want retribution. Retribution implies that Trump and his allies merely want to do to their enemies what was done to them. But Trump was investigated and prosecuted in keeping with the rule of law based on facts and evidence. By contrast, Trump and his allies want to prosecute their enemies without regard for facts and evidence, not to uphold the rule of law, but to attack and undermine it, to realize a variety of corrupt ends. And this is what we want to explore today with our panelists. what they're actually doing, and how successful it might be. So on our panel, we have Mark Zaid, a well-known national security lawyer. We have him on because he represents many of the potential targets of Trump's threats. Olivia Troye, a national security official in the first Trump administration. We have her on because she's been personally threatened numerous times. And Christy Parker, counsel at Protect Democracy, a former federal prosecutor who can talk about what these prosecutions might look like. Welcome, everybody. So let's start with Olivia. Olivia, can you describe the threats you've faced, what you're facing now, and what you think that tells us about what Trump and his allies are really attempting to do?
Well, I can tell you that if this panel had been in person, I had a security detail actually prepared to attend with me. And I should just say that straight out, that I'm sad that we are not in person. And I know we have people on Zoom joining us, but that should tell you where we are in times like today. And I raised my hand when you were introducing us because Mark Zaid is my attorney, and he has been incredibly helpful in helping me navigate this process of the unknown and unexpected. When they do, try to bully me and intimidate me, and the harassment comes in different ways for many of us. It comes whether it's the trolls on social media, which I would say probably that's the least of my worries at times, unless it turns into action. But I've done a good job of cultivating my personal relationship with local law enforcement, gone out of my way to make sure that they know about my family, my situation, what it's like to be in my house and my street and all of that. I have a neighborhood watch program. But on top of that, it's also about the constant, facing of the letters of harassment from people like Kash Patel, who threatened to sue me for anything that I say, and actual lawsuits that have been filed against me. By people.
Can I ask a question about that, actually?
Yeah.
So Kash Patel threatened very publicly to go after you. You publicized that on social media. What do you expect to happen to others in your situation right now? What is this all going to actually look like going forward?
I think you'll see more of that. I think right now, Kash Patel is currently going through confirmation to be the director of the FBI. And so my greatest concern about that scenario is, one, we should take him at his word at the statements he's made in the past about retribution. He's certainly been very public about his intent, and whether he has sat in the confirmation hearing, which I attended in person, and talked about, the fact that, oh, no, there is no list, and I, took it all back. There were people getting fired in that moment. And now we have reports from others that are saying that possibly he was involved in orchestrating that. And so I worry about what's to come for other people in the intelligence community or serving in national security. I worry what's to come for whistleblowers. And I worry what's to come in terms of what happens when someone is running the nation's premier federal law enforcement agency with thoughts of retribution, with thoughts of not actually abiding by what actual rule of law is in terms of what the FBI is actually supposed to do, which is, actually protect the security of all Americans and perhaps not participate in partisan directed witch hunts, and which I believe are something that we may see in the future. And I think that it speaks to the chilling effect of when people do tell the truth, or whether they stand up and take a strong stand against what they're seeing, what happens to those voices along the way, because that's what this is meant to do. It's meant to bully, intimidate, and it does have a chilling effect.
It really does. I can't imagine what you're going through. Mark, can I go over to you now? You have already been a target of Trump. You had your security clearance revoked recently. I want to ask you about that. And also, the larger story here, I think, is that this type of thing, a revocation of security clearance, shows that they have these bureaucratic ways that they can go after people, revoking passports, security clearances, launching IRS investigations, things that kind of stop short of launching a prosecution, something that these things stop short of frog marching people in front of the cameras and saying they're under arrest. Can you talk about this type of bureaucratic harassment? I think people don't really understand what hell it is. And it seems to me that this is something they can actually do fairly easily. Can you talk about what that's going to do to people? And to the degree that you want to talk about your own clients without naming them, we'd welcome that.
Sure. No, thanks for having me here. Well, hey, look, according to the New York Post, I no longer have a security clearance. I don't know if that's true. No one in the U.S. government has told me that. But then even with the 8 of 51 intelligence officers who signed the Hunter Biden laptop letter in October of 2020, they supposedly had their clearances revoked by executive order the first night of the administration, and they still haven't been notified that actual action has taken. Now, this is a real significant action to take against individuals. It's not going to impact me very much. I will be perfectly fine. It hurts actually those who work in the federal government now in the Trump administration, who I wouldn't be able to help should they run into any particular type of issue, most of which is never political. They had a DUI. They went overseas on a foreign trip. They used marijuana when they shouldn't have, a prostitute, whatever. It doesn't matter. I have worked in DC since the Clinton administration. I represent Republicans, Democrats. I have represented cabinet officers, secretaries of defense, members of Congress. I hold administrations accountable for illegalities and ethical violations. It is not my fault that more of those happen in a Trump administration than in other administrations. They do that to themselves. But these tactics are really significant in chilling people for coming forward, right? Many of my clients are whistleblowers, particularly in the intelligence community. So the lack of my clearance hurts them. I can't take them through the pathway, through the legal process, the way we did in the first administration with the intelligence community whistleblower who followed every rule and every law by the book. And I'll say, it's not just retaliation against the clients, which is what I would normally expect. All right, yes, my security clearance, maybe that's been revoked, but I had to have 24/7 armed security living in my house for 2 months during the first impeachment. I've been swatted. I've been doxxed. They come after me all the time as well. And all I am is just a lawyer trying to do my job, most of which, and often, is for Republicans in these administrations as well. So this notion of attacking against their perceived enemies and styling them in any particular way, just like what we heard in the panel before, right? I'm a so-called self-identified national security attorney. You're like, really? Federal courts have ruled I'm an expert in the area that I practice in. And I don't care whether I'm the top or the bottom, but they always try to undermine your credibility by attacking you, whether it's pedophilia, whether it's all sorts of abuse online and disinformation, misinformation, and the notion of, as Olivia has gone through with these threats of lawfare. That's really what lawfare is. It's not what the Trump and his allies went through. It's the use of civil litigation against perceived enemies to try and force them to expend money, to go through stress, to get tied up, to be scared of saying something in response to something that the government might do or say.
Right. I think what we're seeing here is that that's going to be the sort of tip of their spear, really. And that brings us to Christy Parker. Christy, you were a federal prosecutor. We're already seeing another tactic being used to spread fear among the quote unquote deep state. The acting senior deputy attorney general, Emil Bowe, has demanded that the FBI turn over a list of employees who worked on the January 6th cases. That's a pretty big purge. It could number in the thousands, I believe, and FBI agents and employees are now suing to stop it. Christy, what do you make of this? And do you think this is sort of a harbinger of more tactics that we're going to see going forward? What does it feel like to be inside DOJ, do you think, and have something like this happen? What are they going to be doing more of?
Well, I'll tell you that it's hard to even imagine what this must feel like inside the DOJ at this point. I like Mark, I started my career in the federal government during the Clinton administration, and I worked across 4 administrations to include into the the first Trump administration. And I have never seen anything like the way this Justice Department started its tenure in this administration, from issuing memos, directing attorneys that their loyalty was to the President of the United States and not the United States itself, directing them to be personally loyal to him and not to their oaths of office. And then, as you say, this action by the current acting Deputy Attorney General to seek the names of all of the people who worked on the January 6th investigations, which, as you point out, is really most of it's going to be a huge, significant portion of the FBI, because, as we know, there was more than just the case against Donald Trump. There were hundreds of cases that were investigated and prosecuted over a period of 4 years that were still ongoing 2 weeks ago when this administration took office. So that is just a real shift, a politicization of the department like none of us has seen, certainly in the time that I have been old enough to know what was going on in Washington, and absolutely since the time I've been a prosecutor myself.
Steve, can I get a quick answer to this? Just quick follow-up. What do you think that they're trying to achieve with that? In other words, what sort of shift in conduct is that sort of purge designed to bring about among rank and file throughout DOJ? What do they want these people to think and then do?
Well, I think the number one thing that they want people to think is that absolutely under no circumstances should you ever make a suggestion that President Trump or his administration is doing anything criminal. And that just flies in the face of, everything that we are taught a public servant who takes an oath of office to uphold the Constitution is supposed to do. So, this is very clearly intended to have a massive chilling effect, not only on the agents who are being targeted. I mean, obviously, it's meant to have an effect on them, but it's a message to everyone else. It's a message to be, to not be the person who raises, hey, Vice President Agnew may be engaged in corruption and we might need to investigate him. Or, hey, there was something there's something that doesn't just seem quite right about the manner in which the Russians behaved in the 2020 election. The message is don't raise anything like that. And if you do, no matter how obvious the evidence might be that there's something to look into, you better not raise it.
Well, Olivia, let's go back to Kash Patel for a second. As I think one of the panelists brought up earlier, Kash Patel is explicitly on record saying very clearly and forthrightly on a podcast with Steve Bannon that they intend to prosecute enemies without cause. So, Olivia, I want to ask you, as someone who's been targeted by Patel, what do you expect him to do during his first 6 months as FBI director? What could that look like?
I do expect the purge to continue across the ranks of the FBI. I think he will also pursue. He will also be, leading off the purging of the ranks across other departments that coordinate in the national security community that he believes are part of this agenda of the deep state. I can tell you that that's something he seems to really, really abide by. He really believes in that deep state narrative and that everyone is out to get everyone. And I think that's been publicly reported, as you know. But I think that is what I foresee. It's something that I try to remind people of, and I hope that the Republican senators on the Hill, as they consider his confirmation for the director of FBI, that they're thinking about is, there's a reason that more voices aren't out there publicly talking about the danger that Kash Patel poses. And I think that that should speak volumes overall at the fact of the fear of people that don't want to come forward because they don't want to become targets of him. And I think that that says a lot when you have someone that's going to go run the FBI, and that's how people are viewing this entire situation. So I expect them to do frivolous investigations. I don't, I'm under no illusions that the FBI won't show up at my door someday, knock, and just for whatever reason. I know I have the truth on my side. I know I have nothing to hide. And they are people that, were my former colleagues that I worked on counterterrorism with day in and day out. But I fully, I would not discount that. I would not be in disbelief if that happened. And it'll be a lot of harassment like that. And so what I remind Republican senators is just remember, should you step out of line and you have a complete loyalist as a head of the FBI who is watching your every move, and if you cross Donald Trump or they feel like you are not abiding by what their code of conduct is, they are likely going to investigate you too. It's only a matter of time. That's how this circle works.
It does seem to me, and from what you're saying, that and everything else we're seeing, that we're going to see some fairly big examples made right off the bat. And Mark Zaid, I want to bring you in on this one. I think maybe people don't appreciate that the Justice Department doesn't actually have to prosecute Trump's enemies. Mere investigations are enough. I mean, we talked earlier about things like revocation of security clearance, passports, IRS investigations, but there are also criminal investigations that can be undertaken by DOJ and the FBI, correct? And that's something that's a lot easier than a prosecution. There are far fewer barriers to doing these investigations, and those constitute tremendous harassment and sometimes outright terror. Can you talk about, as someone who represents a number of these people who are fearing this, what do you think that's going to look like, these types of investigations?
Yes, I mean, I've been involved with those types of investigations for decades, whether it's congressional, where it's really political as far as motivation or legitimate, or it's mistaken investigations where people are pulled in because of an allegation within the different communities, an inspector general's investigation, a security investigation, and a professional office of professional responsibility. And I fully expect, and I've already been retained by numerous peoples within the Department of Justice, the FBI, the National Archives, other agencies who are fearful because they worked on Mar-a-Lago investigation or January 6 cases, that they will be brought in. And look, I've been doing this for a long time. It doesn't faze me, but when you have never experienced that, I can see the fear in their eyes. And frankly, I'm doing it and will be doing it pro bono, whether it's through Whistleblower Aid, my nonprofit organization, or my law firm itself, because I'm not going to allow individuals who perform their duties lawfully, properly, and ethically to be penalized as a result or punished as a result of this administration being so vindictive and retaliatory. So they can be pulled in for interviews. They don't have to be arrested. There may never be a charge, but to have that hanging over your head, that is a real deterrent to folks who, many of whom, frankly, have just tried to retire and go quietly away after serving distinguished careers inside the United States government.
I just want to underscore the gravity of what Mark Zaid just told us. He's been retained by numerous people who simply are guilty of following orders and functioning as public servants. But they think because they did this in some way that the incoming people will view as wrong or disloyal to Trump or in some way on the wrong side of Trump/MAGA narratives, they need to lawyer up and be ready to get targeted.
I mean, we don't want to say following orders, right? Because everybody harkens back to Nazi Germany following orders. That's not what we're talking about, right? These are people who lawfully perform their duties as in the same manner that every administration has done it previously in following the guidelines, the norms, the laws, right? It's not even have to be about following orders so that they can't say, well, but those orders were unlawful. No, they weren't. They're typical due process procedures.
It's terrible. Christy, we're running out of time, so I'd like to hear from each person now, starting with you, Christy. Maybe just take a minute to tell us, just from the prosecutorial perspective, what's the worst case scenario? What could they do if they really decided to go for it, as it were? And then maybe tell us what our recourse is as citizens. What should people do? And then on to Mark and then Olivia answering the second question there.
Sure. I mean, the worst case scenario is exactly what we've been talking about, that they actually do more than just, as bad as firing people is, that they go beyond that and they actually convene grand juries and, probably, as Mark says, investigate people to the point of, costing them their careers or, costing them a lot of money. And, thank goodness for people like Mark who have stepped up to represent people in these situations. The entire legal community that believes in the rule of law needs to stand up and do the same thing and make sure that he's not out there, or he and a handful of people aren't out there on their own doing this. So, that is the worst case, is that they actually do it and they actually go forward, and they prolong these investigations where it's very difficult for there to be, court interventions. Once you get to the stage where they've actually charged somebody, then, we're in a different situation, because let's be clear here, as Mark was saying, take January 6th. There was nothing wrong with those prosecutions. Not a single judge across the entire legal system, Democrat or Republican, has ever said that those cases weren't supported by probable cause, or that the convictions that were obtained were not, were not lawful convictions. Even in the case of President Trump, no judge ever found anything wrong with the indictments, the legality of the indictments in those cases. So, what I would say in terms of what can we do? Support people like Mark. If you're a lawyer with Mark. If you have the resources to give to the people who do that, please step forward and do that. And then I would say, we need to enlist, we've got some great members of Congress participating in this event tonight. We need to have the members of Congress do everything they can when they see unlawful investigations happening to seek to intervene. Do whatever they can if they're in the minority. Get in there, do things that raise the awareness, do whatever you can do to gum it up. And let's not take it. Let's not sit back and take it.
We do need Democrats in Congress to really step up at this moment. People listening, you can let your Democratic member of Congress know that. Mark, Zaid, and Olivia Troye, just a few seconds each. What can people do? What recourse do people have?
Yeah, to help us at Whistleblower Aid, whistleblower.aid.org. And particularly one thing that concerns me, which I'll say 2 seconds on, the next step when the Trump administration refuses to abide by a federal court order. I have strength right now as a lawyer, and we are winning in the legal battles. But if that happens, then honestly, I'm not quite sure what we're supposed to do as a result of that action. But anyone who can help support us in representing whistleblowers, greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Mark. Olivia, any thoughts on what recourse citizens have?
I would say that that's my biggest fear, is what Mark Zaid just said. And I'm under no illusions that is something that could happen when they start to show plain disregard for that. So I would say that leads to, really, it's important to stay informed. I know we're in an era right now where there's so much happening and there's so much information, and people are just like, I just don't want to watch this chaos again. I can't stomach it anymore. Trust me, I feel the same way. But I think it's important to really pay attention. And when you see retaliation happening and you start to see kind of these efforts, make your voices heard. Like, write letters to the editor, follow your investigative journalist, follow Greg, pay attention to what's going on, and call your members of Congress and remind them, our voices as people still matter. They may make us feel like they don't, but they do matter. And yes, support whistleblower aid, support Protect Democracy. I know Christy's there. Support other organizations that are really doing the work to help people like myself and others. Because I think what people oftentimes forget is it takes not only just personal emotional toll, but financial toll on our families to constantly be providing security for ourselves, hiring lawyers and things like that. And lastly, I would say that when you see someone that is facing these kinds of things, just tell them and show your support. Thank people like Mark, thank people like Greg for covering it. Thank these people for taking a stand. And because
absolutely.
I tell you, it never
Just
gets old.
Well, key point there. Thank you to all our panelists. We really appreciate everything you're doing right now, and thanks for talking to us tonight.
Thank you.
And now, our next panel, The New Economy, moderated by staff writer at The New Republic, Timothy Noah.
Welcome to our panel on the new economy, which is to say an economy that was in reasonably good health on January 20th when Donald Trump came into office. And it's now imperiled by various policies that the Trump administration is considering, discussing, or pushing forward, including last Sunday, a brief threat by the president not to honor payments on the national debt, a threat that was quickly denied by the National Economic Chair, Kevin Hassett. We're going to talk today mostly about taxes and tariffs, but some other topics may come up as well. I'd like to introduce members of our panel. We have Representative Pramila Jayapal, who was elected in 2016 to represent Washington's 7th District, which includes most of Seattle. She's on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Budget Committee and is Chair Emerita of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We have Jared Bernstein, who's former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. During the Obama administration, he was chief economist to then Vice President Joe Biden, and he's also worked at the nonprofit Economic Policy Institute and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And finally, we have Elizabeth Wilkins, who's president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, which is a think tank and nonprofit partner to the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. Previously, she was chief of staff to Lena Khan of the Federal Trade Commission and a senior advisor to White House Chief of Staff Ron Klain. Again, I am Timothy Noah, staff writer at The New Republic, where I frequently write on economic issues. We're going to start today with some opening comments by Representative Jayapal, the sole office holder among us. So I turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Timothy. And it's great to be here today with some really important friends and leaders on this panel to discuss the current state of our economy in the midst of addressing what we were just hearing about on this last panel, the very real dangers that we face of a constitutional crisis where an authoritarian leader, aided by an unelected billionaire, plan a complete takeover of power, illegally violating Article 1 powers of Congress, and even suggesting that they can ignore the judicial branch's rulings. Meanwhile, we're watching the chaos in the economy and in their plans and proposals to cut programs and benefits to working and poor Americans, to squeeze taxpayers, to pay for giant billionaire and corporate tax breaks. Tomorrow, we're going to be marking up the Republican Budget Committee resolution. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, I got back on the Budget Committee again. And I believe it's going to be at least a 12-hour markup. And I do expect that every single Democrat will be voting against the resolution. And we will be offering a whole series of amendments that point out their hypocrisies, their outrages, and also put forward our proposals in the course of that. Republicans are promoting their budget plan as a, quote, cost-saving measure. And I think it's really important that everybody on this call, certainly those of us in Congress, will do this, do our work to amplify that these so-called cost savings are actually squeezing billions of dollars out of Medicaid, killing the ACA, making healthcare more expensive, stripping away all those IRA provisions that Jared and Elizabeth and all of us worked so hard to make happen, that transitioned us to, or began the transition to, a green economy, created jobs. They want to stop all the life-saving student loan forgiveness. That's where most of their cuts in the education department, along with cutting Head Start and Pell Grants, that's all part of their agenda. Now they're combining those cuts with a bunch of what I'm calling magic money. It's money that they just made appear suddenly so that their at least $4 to $5.5 trillion extension of the Trump tax cuts somehow appear to cost less. We need to stay united on our messaging. We need to make it clear that they have the majorities in the House, the Senate, and the White House, so it is on them to govern. We cannot be complicit in moving these terrible, ineffective, and cruel ideas. And if they can't get their Republicans and ruin party together to pass their bad stuff, then Democrats can't be complicit in helping them to strip away benefits and services. In the minority, it's true, we can't pass bills, but we can use our platforms to shine a light on what they're doing, to remind people with repetitive, understandable, simple messaging that Trump said he would lower prices on day one. And guess what? Almost a month in, and his bad policies are already driving prices up, not down, hurting the economy, hurting poor and working people. We can have a consistent and clear message. We can work with outside groups to issue, research papers, shadow hearings, take actions that take on giant corporations that are price gouging, engaging in monopolistic practices, driving out competition, raising prices for consumers and lowering wages for workers, whether it's in the grocery, healthcare, big tech, or housing sectors, among others. And I'm actually getting a caucus started to do just this across the country. We can refuse to make it easy for them by making sure we stick together as a Democratic caucus and standing up against the destruction of our government and our economy and our communities. And we can also push our inside-outside organizing, and that's why I'm so grateful to everybody that's on this call tonight, to make sure that we are building the movement, to make sure that we are lifting up stories and also targeting Republicans whose constituents will be deeply hurt. Just remember that even though we're in the minority, it's such a close minority that if we could just pressure 3 Republicans to be with us on any given issue in the House, we actually could move legislation in the House. And so that is an important point, is to constantly be thinking about who might those 3 Republicans be in a given scenario, even if those bills may not make it across the finish line in the Senate. And of course, we're working closely with the lawyers and the groups around the lawsuits that are being filed, and we're filing our own set of amicus briefs in support of those lawsuits as members of Congress. Despite the chaos and the flood the zone horror that we're dealing with, I do want to make the point that I think we are already seeing some success, and we do have a real opportunity here. Already, the polling is showing that there are 2/3 of Americans who do not think that Donald Trump is focusing enough on lowering prices, which is the main reason that he was elected. Half of Americans already believe that he is bringing corruption into the government instead of fixing it. And a majority do not like an unelected billionaire making all these decisions, including ones where he has direct conflicts of interest. So I'm looking forward to this panel. I think it's a very important moment for us, particularly with the budget shutdown coming up, and with all of the work that's going to be happening over the next couple of months to really move a horrific agenda that extends those Trump tax cuts from Trump 1.0 to actually even more than that this time around. So thanks, Timothy, and all of you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you. Let me pose my first question to Elizabeth Wilkins, who played an important role in the Biden administration. President Joe Biden opposed continuing the Trump tax cuts. He just wanted to preserve those cuts for people earning less than $400,000 a year. Extending all of them is going to cost $4.5 trillion. And the House proposal today proposes $2 trillion in cuts, unspecified cuts to entitlements, but we all know that means mostly Medicaid, right? So Elizabeth Wilkins, I ask you, isn't this redistributing income upwards from Medicaid recipients to millionaires?
I couldn't have put it better myself, Tim. I mean, if you want to just step back for a moment, we have a president who ran on a promise that he was going to do things for regular working class Americans, right? And what we are actually seeing as we watch these proposals come in is exactly the opposite. We have a budget resolution that will raise low and moderate income families' costs in healthcare, in food, in energy, on the eve of a tax extension that's going to be primarily to benefit the rich. I mean, it couldn't be farther from the things that the American people were promised. So even, and I think you can look at whatever economic policy you want to, whether it is the budget resolution, whether it is the tax package, whether it is the use of tariffs. Are working families in the center of these policies, or are they kind of the victims of these policies? I think we will see more and more a drumbeat of a very particular answer to that question.
Jared, I'd like to ask you about tariffs. The great dream of Donald Trump is to return to the 19th century where we can replace the income tax with tariffs. And he wants to create this external revenue service, which he sees tariffs as a source of revenue, which is remarkable and would mean catastrophic inflation, would it not?
Well, first of all, if Donald Trump wants to go back to the 19th century, I think we should open the time portal and let him go. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting framing from him because he likes to argue that tariffs are not a tax, and yet he calls his tariff tax collector the External Revenue Service. So he's implicitly recognizing that tariffs are a tax, and they're a tax paid at first in the first step by the importing company. So U.S. companies who are importing tariffed goods, and those costs are passed forward typically to consumers. So that's why you heard Representative Jayapal correctly pointing out that these tariffs will raise consumer prices, pushing in exactly the opposite direction. Now, what Donald Trump says, and his team of really tariff admirers, tariff lovers, because they're really into this. And I should say, by the way, that there is a role in an economy like ours for narrowly targeted tariffs. I mean, I've paid attention to global trade my whole career and have been very willing to apply tariffs to rubber tires grade 4 or chicken part, grade 3, because some other country is dumping them to unfairly grab market share here. That's not this. These are sweeping tariffs, and they've been shown time and again not to have their desired effect. Now, getting back to the revenue question for a second, if one of the things that Trump says is that don't worry, these tariffs will not block these tariffs by blocking imports from coming in because we're raising the price of those imports to domestic consumers. That's going to make more people buy domestically, and eventually we'll have less of a trade deficit. Now, that's never been shown to be empirically the case for reasons I can get into. Tariffs don't tend to do much to the trade deficit. They tend to depress both imports and exports. But if that were the case, if the point of tariffs was to block imports, there'd be no revenues. So I think these revenue scores, which are actually kind of get up pretty high, I've seen revenue scores, in the trillions, are way too optimistic. And I guess hitchhiking on to Representative Jayapal's point, I think this is in your meetings, Representative. I think that we should have a kind of a sub conversation about what I would consider a very unrealistic score if you're counting on tariffs for much on the revenue side.
Representative Jayapal, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this strange remark of President Trump's over the weekend when he kind of threatened not to honor the national debt. And we had, which was such an explosive thing for him to say, that we saw a number of White House aides say that that's not what he said, that he said something different. But he said it was on tape. You could hear him say it. He was claiming that certain treasuries didn't have to be honored. If past patterns are any guide, Trump is probably going to say this again and again until he sees a market reaction that scares him to death. Would you agree, Representative Jayapal? And what should Democrats be doing about this?
Yeah, I mean, I do agree that he says a lot of things for reaction, and he puts out proposals to try and get something, usually through fear and threatening. So even the tariffs, if you were thinking about tariffs in terms of pure economics, you would talk about it one way. But note that initially when he started talking about tariffs, it was to threaten Canada and Mexico to do certain things on immigration. And other factors that didn't have to do with actually building a manufacturing base in the United States, keeping jobs here in the United States. There was no investment that was targeting that in the way that the Biden administration did. And so I think that with the national debt, this is what he continually does to kind of throw us off our feet and have us respond to whatever that is. I would say that the real question here is, what are they going to do with the debt ceiling when that comes up? Because they need to, if they put it into the budget resolution, then they're going to have to specify by how much, as Jared well knows. And so, they're trying, originally they weren't going to put it into the budget resolution. Now they're talking about perhaps they will put it in to the budget resolution. Because they know they want us to be forced to raise the debt ceiling so that they can pass these giant tax breaks. And now they're also having to deal with, are they going to extend the tax breaks permanently, or is it going to be for a shorter period of time? Because the fight that you're seeing between Republicans right now, I called it Republicans in ruin, because they are not in line yet. They are, you have the Jody Arringtons on the Budget Committee and the Freedom Caucus folks who are saying we can't increase the deficit by this much. We need to have more spending cuts. But they know that if they get into that level of spending cuts, it's going to hurt their constituents. And then you have Jason Smith saying, $4.5 trillion is not enough. That's a good start, I think, was his remark on Jody Arrington's resolution, because he knows it's more like 5.5 to 6, and that's with magic money included. So I think that all of these comments, whether Trump's making comments about the national debt and ignoring the national debt, or whether it's actually about the detail of how we get to any kind of a budget and appropriations bills, this is all about how do they cloak what they are doing, which is really about ripping off working people and poor people across this country and making them pay for the tax breaks. It's like they're going to throw in perhaps a small continuation of a tax break, but I think we have to look at that and say they're going to get gold bars and the American people are going to get breadcrumbs, because 2 weeks of groceries, which is what a $750 tax break might be, 2 or 3 weeks of groceries for a working family, is nothing compared to the yacht that the billionaires are getting. So I think we're going to have to keep drawing those contrasts very clearly so that people understand they are taking, just as you said, Timothy, they are taking from the poor and working class and giving to the rich. Huge, giant transfer of wealth.
Well, let's talk about rich people for a second. Let's talk about the bond market. I know as a good liberal, I'm not supposed to care about the bond market, but the bond market has been very nervous lately about deficits. Over the past year, it started under President Biden. It's continued under President Trump. And I'd ask Elizabeth Wilkins, do you think we might see some pressure on Trump and on other Republicans from the bond market? Does Trump care about what happens to interest rates?
I promise I'm going to answer your question, but I am going to go back to something that Jared said about the External Revenue Service idea, because I think it's really important. Mm-hmm. When we think, if we take this idea seriously, that we're going to raise some significant portion of our national funds from external rather than internal sources, I think we lose two things. One, to create an inclusive and dynamic and equitable economy, we need significant investments that are not going to come from the revenue raised by an external revenue service. But two, taxes are not just about raising revenue. They are, but they are also about rebalancing power in the economy. The way that we decide to levy taxes, whether we decide to tax the wealthy, whether we decide to tax economic activity that is actually detrimental to markets working in the way that we think that they should to create equity, is a hugely important tool in our toolbox to create the kind of economy that we want. So when I hear the administration talking about an external revenue service, I don't just hear an interest in a policy around tariffs, which I agree with Jared. There are times when we actually think tariffs are a useful tool for creating the economy that we want. But I also hear a long-term disinvestment in the kinds of things that we know we need to create an economy for low and moderate income Americans to participate. And also we see an abandonment of a tool that is incredibly important to rebalance that power and make things more equitable. So I want to make sure that we have on the table not just the ways in which this tax bill will do the wrong things, but how we are leaving on the table taxes as an extraordinarily important tool of economic policy, the way that we should see it. Now, just to your point, this is a fascinating thing that I think we are seeing in economic policy with this administration generally. We're seeing trying some stuff, throwing some stuff out there, saying some things, seeing what the reaction is, and then honestly, sometimes wildly pulling back, right? This is what we saw with the Mexico and Canada tariffs. Mm-hmm. That was the quickest turnaround on a tariff policy that I've ever seen. And that is in part because I do think that this is an administration that is very sensitive to certain types of reaction from a Wall Street crowd, frankly. That's the echo chamber that is of interest to them. So to the degree that we are, in an odd way, looking for sources of guardrails for what this administration might do, as odd as this might sound, market reactions might be one of the few things that actually help keep the administration in check. It doesn't give me a great amount of solace, but I do think it's there. And I do also think, I think as we watch some of these policies come out fast and furious, it feels a little bit like an onslaught, and it feels as though, it feels very coordinated. It feels like we might be scrambling to respond. And sometimes we can forget these moments where the administration actually tries something, realizes there's a bad reaction on the part of people that they actually care about and pulls back very quickly. Again, we saw that with some of the tariffs. We saw that with the OMB memo stopping spending. We actually are seeing a sort of a shock and awe tactic that isn't, I think, nearly sometimes as thoughtful and coordinated as we think it is. It is actually sometimes chaos and unintended chaos that can backfire.
Jared, do you have any thoughts on this as well?
Many. So first of all, you said, I know it's not cool to care about the bond market or something like that, but I think it is cool. And I think we should care about it a ton for a number of reasons. First of all, Elizabeth is 100% correct. One of the reasons the Mexican and Canadian tariffs were delayed was because the market opened down 650 points that day. I worry that there are almost no disciplinary institutions out there, with total respect for Representative Jayapal and what they're trying to do. But of course, the majority is not a force for good right now. I'm worried about the Supreme Court as a guardrail. And, we've heard from other panels today. I don't think this is an unfamiliar concern. I do think that the financial markets are a potential source of discipline for the administration. Trump cares about that. And so you're absolutely right. The bond markets are raising a big fat eyebrow at the extent to which our fiscal path is not sustainable. We tried to help make it more sustainable. We weren't able to legislate very significant and progressive tax increases, along with some robust spending cuts. And as the representative pointed out, this is going to get way worse before it gets better. And I do think the markets will react badly. Now, here's the other thing. Look, we're carrying a debt load that's 100% of our economy, debt held by the public. So we're talking about, something like $29 trillion in debt held by the public. Now, you know me, Tim, and the other folks here. I've never been a deficit hawk or someone who has been, unduly concerned about deficits, but at some point, sustainability actually becomes important. And when I say the bond market is raising an eyebrow, I actually think that that destination, wherever it is closer than it's been. So we have to be mindful of the bond market because, and it's a global market. That's how we finance our debt. And if the thing to look for, Tim, I'm sure you've looked at this yourself, the thing to look for is whether interest rates are going up, especially this part of the interest rate that they call the term premium, which is the part of the interest rate that represents an extra return that creditors ask for, that people lending to the government want to get if they get a little nervous about the fiscal outlook, the fiscal path. And so we are seeing some upward pressure on rates. It's a source that can discipline the administration. I know we're short for time. I want to just say one other thing, and this is about the debt ceiling. So this is probably not what Representative Jayapal may exactly want to hear. And whatever direction she wants to go, that's the direction I want to go too on this. But I just want to suggest that if they're having been in government and having seen the terrible destruction by threats of people who have no regard for this country's economy, the threats to default, to weaponize the debt ceiling as people have done, is unconscionable and pretty horrible. So if there's an opportunity in here somewhere to get rid of the debt ceiling, frankly, I would jump at it.
Yeah, Timothy, I have to. This is an important conversation. I agree, and as you know, I think, Jared, I've been in favor of that for some time. I think the timing of it is very important. So in other words, if we do it now, it opens the doors for their tax scam. And you know what they did to us last time. And I think there would be real problems. But I do think that it may be that there's an opportunity for us to get rid of it later, perhaps when Trump is still in office, but Democrats have control of the House. I don't know. We have to see what that looks like. But I don't want to bring a butter knife to a gunfight. We are going to have to use every tool in our toolbox to stop them from doing another massive transfer of wealth with their tax scam. And so I think that's the only thing I would say. I'm with you on, and I think we did the press conference when the president called me actually and said that was so great. We did a whole press conference on the debt ceiling when they were using it and weaponizing it in ways that it hadn't been before. But guess what? They have weaponized it now, and they are trying to move and do things that would absolutely destroy all of the good work that you and Elizabeth and all of us did over the last 4 years.
I'd like to get a clarification on what you're saying, because I know some Democrats are saying we should do a government shutdown, which doesn't strike me as making a lot of sense when you're dealing with a Republican president who's already trying to shut down the government. But do you have any thoughts about that strategy?
I absolutely do, because I keep getting asked about that over the last 24 hours. Look, we do not have the power to shut down the government. We are in the minority. There is no such thing as Democrats shutting down the government, because we are the minority. Republicans have the House, the Senate, and the White House. So if the government shuts down because they can't get all of their party to agree on some terrible proposal that they have, then that's on them. That's not on Democrats. And so I just want to be very clear that we can't shut down the government. That is Republicans who own that completely. They have all three branches of Congress and the White House, and they have to govern and they have to do it. We can't be complicit in moving forward something that is stripping Americans of critical benefits and services and participating in the transfer of wealth. But we're not shutting down the government, because guess what? We're the minority.
So you're basically saying that they can't count on Democrats to bail them out with their fiscal hawks.
That's right. I mean, they're going to have to be able to bring their party together to move their bad ideas. Democrats are not going to go along with their bad ideas. Now, if they really want to, last time it was different, right? Because we had the White House and we had the Senate. So it was a little bit more complicated for us. But this time around, there's no reason that if they want to actually work with us and put together something that we could agree to, that's a totally different thing. But what they're trying to move right now, their entire agenda is bad for working people. It is bad for America. It is bad for every aspect of our lives. And we can't be complicit and try to move that.
Okay, well, on that note, we're going to wrap up. I think this has been a really enlightening conversation, and I thank the three of you for participating. And so we are going to move on now to the next panel.
Our next session, Bad Business, Corporate Complicity in the Climate Crisis, is moderated by Director for Public Citizens Climate Accountability Project, Aaron Ruggenberg.
Well, hello. My name is Aaron Regenberg. I'm the director of the Climate Accountability Project for Public Citizen, where we're fighting to hold big oil companies accountable for their climate crimes. And it is my pleasure to be here tonight to introduce Bob Musil. Bob is the president and CEO of the Rachel Carson Council, the environmental organization that Rachel Carson asked her friends and colleagues to start as she was dying of breast cancer while writing Silent Spring. Over the course of Bob's career, he has also served as the longtime CEO of Physicians for Social Responsibility and has led campaigns against nuclear weapons, wars in the Persian Gulf and Iraq, gun violence, industrial agriculture, toxic chemicals, global warming, and of course, government and corporate responsibility for these interconnected harms to people and the environment. It's great to see you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron, and thank you for the work you've been doing with Public Citizen and the wonderful lawsuits that you're carrying out. And if you're just joining us at this hour, I want to repeat something that when we began this wonderful program, New Republic editor Michael Tomasky said that he wished and was sorry that we are not live and that we are each of us in little Zoom boxes. And I want to emphasize that we are not alone. And part of what I want to talk about with you is this idea that all of us, there would have been hundreds of people in the room in the Performing Arts Center. There are now thousands of you watching us streaming, and many more as this will circulate through the ethosphere. And so I want each person to consider the fact that it's not just 12 panelists, a couple of Congress people, a wonderful editor like Michael Tomasky, that we are the people, and that had you tuned in earlier, or if you were watching, you would have seen Representative Bennie Thompson give the keynote address. It was incredibly powerful because what Bennie Thompson said, being the representative from Mississippi, is that although the government is currently in the hands of Trump and his minions, that although we have an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch, that we know that even in the Constitution and that as a nation, it is we the people who are in charge. We created the Constitution, created the government, and it is up to us to actually do something about this crisis. And so you don't have to be an economic expert. You don't have to be a member of Congress. You don't have to be one of these panelists. I want to talk with you about what it is that we can do, that we can stand up, that we can fight back. And people are already doing that. We just heard Representative Jayapal quoting the shift that is already beginning, which people are beginning to understand that the president, surprise, has been lying that he's going to help working people, that he's going to lower prices, that he's going to fix everything, he's going to make a deal. That is now filtering around the nation in every facet. And that is something I think should give us real hope. I wanted to also just add a little bit, Aaron and I are here talking about corporate complicity in the climate crisis. I think what we need to understand is that all of our crises are interconnected now. And thank you in that nice introduction. In my perhaps overlong career, working against wars and against gun violence, against nuclear weapons, against industrial farms and toxic chemicals. These are things that are all connected, and now every aspect of civil society is concerned about them. And that is something that we can find great strength in. But also, we are talking about the climate crisis. And I want to remind you that among the many ills we've been hearing about that the new president is up to, it's well known that he believes that global climate change, which President Biden called an existential threat to our existence, that the president thinks it's a hoax. Pull out of the Paris agreements, destroy the EPA, carry out acts that will threaten the entire planet as well as the people on it. And so we need to think about corporate complicity backed by Trump, who would like to get rid of any government brakes on this, in the climate crisis, as well as the economic crisis, the religious freedom crisis, the women's rights crisis. It's all a crisis. But I think that there is something that we can all do together.
Well, that was very well said and so important. I'm wondering, Bob, if you can share a bit about how an environmental organization like the Rachel Carson Council is taking on corporate complicity in the climate crisis right now.
Ah, well, there are a number of ways. But again, I just want to remind people, I know from speaking around the country and college campuses and elsewhere for many, many years, people are no longer terribly aware of Rachel Carson, who wrote Silent Spring. It was an attack on corporations that were spraying chemicals, DDT and others, mindlessly around the country, which was killing birds and fish and bugs and harming people. And that was the great strength of that book, that it caught people's attention that this affects me. And of course, she was attacked by fake scientists, by corporate paid doctors wearing white coats saying this lady is crazy. She's got feminine hysteria. She's not really womanly anyhow, just endless slurs, a playbook that we are seeing repeated now. But Carson was not this lone author who wrote a book and poof, it attracted the attention of John F. Kennedy. It started the environmental movement. The truth is that she was highly political, was deeply engaged in politics and science, and saw the need to put them together so that, excuse me, she spoke out, wrote about, testified, helped the Kennedy administration with legislation and speeches, aware early about global climate change, speaking out against it, warning about it. During the Kennedy administration, she was concerned about factory farms and industrial agriculture, meaning putting millions of hogs and chickens into impossible conditions, caged and pumped full of hormones and growth hormones and chemicals. And she warned about that. She obviously talked about pesticides. And what she understood was that they were connected. And so the Rachel Carson Council is a group that, as she was dying of breast cancer, writing Silent Spring, she said to her friends and colleagues, I want you to start a group that will carry on my work when I die. That is the Rachel Carson Council. It's operating today, and we follow not the biblical letter of Rachel Carson. If you were watching earlier and saw that wonderful panel with Americans United Against Church and, for Church and State about the threat of Christian nationalism, that's not what we're talking about. We follow and draw on the principles, the ethics, the concerns of Carson brought into the modern era. Let me perhaps talk specifically on what we're doing that connects up environmental issues, economic issues, health issues, all in a particular new problem for climate change and for what we call climate justice, environmental justice, which is, you may not have heard of this, I'm going to bet you haven't, the clear cutting of forests in North Carolina, then down the Gulf Coast, now out to California and the Pacific Northwest, in which, backed by mainly a couple of corporations and some other ones, but the Drax Corporation and the Enviva Corporation, starting just a couple of decades, so this is new, it is a problem that has not received sufficient attention, that is causing tremendous problems, which is why we're working on it. And so that clear cutting is now spreading wildly. They take the wood, the forests, the trees that they've cut down and say, oh, we don't do that. But of course, independent journalists, independent organizations and advocacy groups like the Dogwood Alliance that we work with follow them around and take pictures, both of their trucks loading up, of the trees being cut, from small planes in the air, all, again, classic corporate lies. They then take all of these logs and wood and grind it up in industrial-like facilities in these areas and turn them into dried out wood pellets by the millions of tons. This is not the little old, for those of you who remember the 70s, people took a little bit of wood pellets and put them in a wood stove. That was like the beginning of natural energy and so on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about an industrial scale. And then these pellets are shipped overseas, primarily to the EU and particularly to the United Kingdom, where Drax, one of the main corporations, is headquartered. And there, they are combusted, burned in old coal-fired utilities that we managed to shut down that are no longer being used, and they create and burn them for energy. The results are horrendous for the climate, the production of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. But back here in the States, in these areas, North Carolina, the Gulf, and now heading west, all of this happens, say, in North Carolina, where we began this work just about a decade ago. And we learned about it from people on the ground. And this is a sort of classic, Aaron, and you know from the suits that you bring, and that the people whose lives were being disrupted, whose forest and forest land was being cut, who were living next to and having their lives destroyed by pollution and noise and trucks, happened to be in only about 7 counties in North Carolina when we started. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that those counties are amongst the poorest, most heavily populated by African Americans and other underrepresented people, Latinos, indigenous folks, and they are the ones who first began to fight back, to look for allies and say, we need people who can support us, who may have some access to power that we don't, or know people they can talk to. And that is how we stepped up, and that's how we got involved. And that's the main project that we're working on right now around corporate complicity.
That's such inspiring work. And I think it's worth, as you noted, it's worth really underlining that it is the same playbook again and again, right? Whether it's Philip Morris or ExxonMobil or Drax, right? The strategy is to use disinformation to essentially defraud the public, right? Suppress alternatives and lock us into lethal climate disasters that these corporations knew were coming, right? That there's a concept in the law for when someone consciously disregards a substantial risk of causing harm to another person. That's criminal recklessness. And that's what we at Public Citizen mean when we say climate losses aren't just tragedies, these are crimes.
Yeah. Aaron, when you talk about personal harms or harms to people and so on, I'm not an attorney, but I learned about corporate influence on this following legislative battles in North Carolina, where we, the Rachel Carson Council, of course, I have to say, rachelcarsoncouncil.org, www.rachelcarsoncouncil.org. Please sign up. But we were working on the problem of factory farms in North Carolina where there are about 10 million hogs held in captivity who can't move around, and they are owned by the Smithfield Corporation. And that in turn, Smithfield is owned by a Chinese holding company called the WH Group. They bought up all of the CAFOs and Smithfield stuff because they found it was cheaper and more economical and easier to produce the stuff over here and not screw up back in China. But so the people I mentioned on the ground, in the communities, were the ones who were first fighting this. And we worked with a woman now deceased. She lived a long life battling these folks, named Elsie Herring in North Carolina. And she and others brought nuisance suits because their livelihood, their homes,
Right.
their ability to even just keep the windows open, were all being harmed living right next to these CAFOs. And so North
Bob,
Carolina.
I don't want to cut you off, but just we're coming a little short on time, so I just wanted to
Sure.
maybe ask
Okay.
one last question, which
Well,
is
in that battle over the legislation, the North Carolina legislatures wanted to end nuisance suits, and it was the Smithfield Corporation that wrote the legislation, handed it to a CAFO owner who represents Eastern North Carolina, and brought it to the legislature. And that was a quick lesson on corporate complicity in climate change and environmental justice.
absolutely. And Bob, you're talking about this work. You've been at this kind of work for a long time, and we're in a very dark moment. I think particularly when we're talking about climate, it's important to figure out how hope fits into the work, because I think honestly, in times like this, for folks who are following the climate science, the case for despair has a lot going for it. But that's not an option. And so I'm interested to hear how you are thinking about hope right now, and what our path forward is in this moment. And then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, great. Well, you can probably tell because we've got video going here that I have been at this a long time. And quickly, keep in mind, back a number of people on the program were talking about having worked in or started with the Clinton administration. Similarly, I was at Kyoto, in the Kyoto Protocol, where Al Gore was there. We outside groups had to actually help push Al and the Clinton administration to actually participate and do something there. But we were facing a coalition of over 100 American corporations, the entire fossil fuel industry, all of automobiles, utilities, electricity, railroads, coal, and more. Over time, because of the actions of people acting around the nation at the grassroots and in organizations and journalists, as we've seen, members of Congress who've stepped up, the number of corporations and bad actors on climate is much reduced. It's not gone. ExxonMobil would be the poster child of this. And the Rachel Carson Council has been battling them and fossil fuels for a long time. But what gives me hope is that an entire new generation is growing up, that we have a campus network of over 75 colleges and universities, thousands and thousands of student and faculty activists. We have helped them, some of our fellows, we give fellowships to environmental activists on campuses that work with the Rachel Carson Council. They have brought suit against those universities that haven't divested their funds from fossil fuels, said they would. And that has led to further action, so that now those divestment movements have spread into concerns about all the issues we've been talking about, as well as the war in Gaza and other issues. And that kind of movement, and my own staff, I think they're watching. Hello. They're a lot younger than me, in their 20s. They are out demonstrating in front of Treasury because of Musk and Trump, with members of Congress, like we're going to see Jamie Raskin soon. All of those actions, a new generation that will pick up and carry this ball, because it isn't going to be solved in 4 years, and it's not going to be solved in a longer time than that. If you are out there, I think my grandchildren may be watching. If you are younger, join up with every group you've seen here. Send them money, join their actions, be on their lists. That's the Rachel Carson Council, Public Citizen, AU, Americans United, and all of them. That's where you can begin and take action. And
well, I think that's the perfect place to wrap. Thank you so much, Bob.
All right.
Let's keep up the fight.
Hey, everybody, it's Congressman Jamie Raskin from Maryland's beautiful 8th Congressional District. And I've been able to tune in episodically throughout all of the deliberations this evening. I was asked by Mike Tomasky just to give everybody a send-off, and it is going to be a brief send-off because, forgive me, but I thought I was going to be finishing up at 8:30, and I have another event I need to start at 8:45. So I'm just going to give you a few thoughts before we go, and I'm sure everybody is already charged up and inspired by the terrific conversations that just took place. I was reflecting as I was listening to the last round that to get through a moment like this, it's positive to follow the advice of Spinoza, who said, always take the view from eternity. And so I think we've got to view ourselves in a much larger historical panorama in order to have some sense of equipoise about the nightmare we're living through. And let's start with the very biggest perspective we could get on it. The Big Bang took place 13.5 billion years ago, and our Earth came into existence 4.5 billion years ago. And then Homo sapiens, or creatures who somewhat resembled us, didn't come into being until like 300 or 350,000 years ago. And then, the United States of America came into being just 250 years ago. Under conditions of enslavement of human beings and marginalization of women and lots of social subordination. And that was an improvement on being colonial subjects. And there was, of course, tremendous dispossession of Native Americans and the stealing of their lands. And yet a process began with the Declaration of Independence and the assertion of consent of the governed and the unalienable rights of the people, life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, and the idea that everybody's created equal. And so as flawed and as deformed as the social conditions were, including those involving Thomas Jefferson, who wrote those beautiful words and yet was himself deeply compromised and complicit by the system of slavery, those ideas were proclaimed and started something tremendously valuable in the history of this species, because up until then, most everybody had always lived under kings and queens and emperors and czars and officially established churches. And the Enlightenment revolutionaries, led by people like Tom Paine and Ben Franklin and Jefferson and Adams, were suggesting that society could be organized on a different principle. And, Tom Paine got here in 1774 and fell in love with the promise of America. He said, if this land lives up to its ideals, it could become, he said, an asylum to humanity. Not an insane asylum, mind you, but a place of refuge for people fleeing from political and religious oppression from all over the world. And then he wrote Common Sense, a document that was so electrifying and so radical that it transformed everybody's ideas about what might be possible. Even Ben Franklin, up until that point, didn't dream that it would be a revolution in a social and political system. He thought it would basically just be a separation, a divorce from the United Kingdom and from the crown. And so Tom Paine initiated a completely different conception. And then he wrote Common Sense, which was the pamphlet that ignited the American Revolution. And everything got rolling. But that wasn't that long ago. And of course, the Civil War came in 1861. And then we finally overthrew slavery, at least in the de jure juridical sense. But of course, after the Reconstruction period collapsed and was killed by the restoration of racist white supremacist politics, we lapsed back into all of those social patterns with systems of quasi-slavery emerging in the South, and the Supreme Court basically carving the heart out of the meaning of the 14th Amendment for a long time. And then the system of legalized apartheid, Jim Crow, lasted until 1954. So we got rid of that only about 75 years ago. The Voting Rights Act came in 1965. That was, 60 years ago. And we've lived through such a tremendous backlash against all of that. We saw in 2013 the Supreme Court dismantling the Voting Rights Act in Shelby County versus Holder, cutting the heart out of the judicial pre-clearance mechanism before the covered jurisdictions that had discriminated would have to go to court, to federal court or the Department of Justice to get cleared. And that was cut out of it by saying that the coverage formula was out of date. And so much of our civil rights law was eviscerated by the Supreme Court. And much of what's taking place with Donald Trump and his authoritarian movement today is really putting the icing on the cake of what the Supreme Court has already done. Now, but I don't tell you that history to bum you out in any way, because we are the heirs to the great civilizing movements of our history, which have resisted all of the oppression, the abolitionists and the union fight during the Civil War, and the labor union, trade union fight, and the suffragists, and the civil rights movement, and the women's movement, and LGBTQ movement, the labor movement, the human rights movement, the environmental movement. We are the heirs to these movements. But let us never forget that for most of human history, up until the revolution, and then all the way through up until today, all over the world, most people have lived under conditions of tremendous authoritarianism, with monarchs and kings and dictators like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un and Xi and Donald Trump. That's been the fate of humanity. So democracy has always been the exception. It's always been the exception, and it's always been a struggle. And if we had the luxury of being able to forget that for a while, we no longer have that luxury. We are in the fight of our lives. So I wish I had more time. I'm late for my other thing. I was going to get into the intricacies and the innards of all of these legal fights to defend Article 1 and congressional powers, and the power of the legislature is the preeminent and dominant branch, rightfully understood, and the rights of the people in the Bill of Rights, and the rights of federal workers and the civil service, and what that means. But I think it's probably intuitive and obvious to everybody. We're going to fight this in the courts, and we're going to fight this in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, and we're going to fight this in the streets. And remember, all of the power begins with the people. The three most important words in our Constitution, no doubt: we the people. And those of us who aspire and attain to public office are nothing but the servants of the people. And the moment that anybody thinks they are better than the people, and they are meant to be a king, a lord, a monarch, enjoy any of the titles of nobility which are forbidden by the Constitution, that is the moment to evict, eject, reject, impeach, convict, get rid of them, and start all over again. And so we're going to have to go through that process. It's going to be tough. It's going to be painstaking. I want everybody to take care of themselves. When people stop me on the street and say, what can I do? I say, start by taking care of yourself and your family and your friends, because we're in this for the long haul. And everybody's got to be in good shape for the struggles ahead. So when you've got a chance to take a nap, take a nap. You got a chance to work out, work out. We need everybody's bodies and minds in shape for this fight, but we're going to win it. Like Tom Paine said, the times have found us, and this is our moment to accept this historical assignment to defend democracy and freedom and progress for humanity.